Welcome and thank you for joining us today as we share the barriers that exist in the organic beef supply chain in Canada and explore strategies to overcome those barriers. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Marla Carlson and I am chair of the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee and moderator for today's session. We are pleased to offer the webinar in French. If you would like to access the French channel, you can do that by clicking on the interpretation button or label on the bottom right of your screen. Canadian Organic Growers Office is located in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We would like to recognize the many important contributions Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make. We also want to acknowledge the injustices, both past and present, and encourage settlers to learn the history of the land, which specific First Nations inhabited it, and which First Nations currently reside nearby your place of residence. As a minimal and initial step to reconciliation, to learn more about the history of your area, please visit Whose Land. Before we begin, we're just going to go through a few housekeeping details so that you can get the most out of the webinar. So we'll just flip to there we go. So we've gone through the interpretation bit, but just again, far right corner, if you'd like to listen to the webinar in French, it is being translated for us. If you have any questions that you would like to ask during this session, please the Q&A box. Which is again on the bottom of your screen. And we'd also like to encourage participation amongst the folks who are on the call. So you can do that in the chat function. And David has already dropped a few messages in that chat box. So also to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and will be available to you within 2 business days. And it will also be uploaded to COG's YouTube channel. So just quickly go through the agenda, which is on your screen now: presentation of the findings, presentations of proposed strategies, and then discussion. So we encourage your active participation as we go through. Just a little bit of an introduction before we get started and hand it over to Don, who that's what we're all here to hear from. So today we'll examine and discuss the challenges and opportunities with the Canadian organic beef supply chain. These findings are from the Canadian Access Project, a 2-year initiative by Canadian organic growers managed by David Mazura-Goulet as our project lead. You can connect with David in the chat. The project engaged stakeholders across the country to determine what barriers stand in the way of increasing production and sale of 6 organic crops or sectors. COG and their partners specifically examined the organic carrot, beef, blueberry, salad green, oat, and field pea supply chains in Canada. The Canada Access Project is funded by the Government of Canada through the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Canadian Agricultural Strategic Priorities Program, a $50.3 million 5-year investment to help the agricultural sector adapt and remain competitive. And before we get rolling with the presentation, we're just going to throw a poll up, I believe, onto the screen and would ask if you could let us know which part of the sector you are working in. And we'll just leave that up for a few seconds to give everybody an opportunity to participate. All right. Do a quick look of the results as they come in, and we have, seems like our biggest audience is producers, which is fantastic. Welcome and thank you for being here. Followed closely by non-profits. So thank you also for being here. And then we also have processors, distributors, retailers, and government. So we have wide range of sectors represented here today, which is also encouraging. So thank you all for being here. And I think we'll close the poll. And are you going to share the results for us, David?
We have.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so now we'll move over to Dawn Murray, and I will leave it to you to introduce yourself. Thanks, Dawn.
Great, and I will share my screen then. And I'm assuming my screen is now up for everyone to see.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it is.
Great, thanks. And joining me on this this presentation today are my colleagues, Harry Cummings, he's in Guelph, Ontario. Christine Zwart is in Victoria, BC, and I'm based out of Kamloops, BC. So the three of us are on and involved in this presentation this morning, and have been involved in the research and data collection to date. I've been involved with Harry Cummings and Associates for going on 20 years now. We specialize in planning and development work, also program evaluation work. Have been active in the agriculture sector for many, many years. Have conducted a number of economic impact studies in Ontario. Have also worked extensively in doing work in facilitating networking between producers and other elements of the supply chain in different parts of the country. And we've also worked on behalf of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture in some of their strategic planning activities as well. So working on this project, even though we haven't done extensive work in the organic sector before, we have done a fair bit of work in the agricultural sector, which is good context for doing this work in any event. I wanted to start off by just walking this group through the research methods that we went through as part of this process of looking at the barriers, challenges, and future opportunities for expanding growth in the organic sector, in this case, the beef sector. We worked with the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee in identifying a number of stakeholders for us to reach out to participate in interviews and to hear directly from them about what they're encountering and experiencing in terms of barriers on the production side and in their interactions and engagement with other components of the supply chain, looking for those issues or areas where there's a bottleneck or other challenges that are getting in the way of them maintaining, sustaining, and potentially even expanding their existing production. So ultimately, we reached out to a total of 28 stakeholders that were initially invited to participate, and 16 stakeholders ultimately participated in an interview with us. That group consisted of 15 producers, 13 of which are currently involved in beef production. One producer was previously involved in a co-op operation. And another producer is currently involved in dairy production, and their cull cows go into the red meat supply chain. We also had an independent butcher that participated in an interview as part of that process. And at least one of the producers that we spoke with is also involved with a meat cutting processing operation. Now, several of the producers did confirm that at this time they are not certified organic, but they are following many of the organic principles. And we'll come back and touch on some of the factors around why it is that that's the case right now, that they're sort of not certified organic as part of our discussion on the challenges. Not surprisingly, many of the producers are involved in various crop production activities as well. So in addition to growing their sort of hay crops, be it clover or grass, some of the producers are involved in other sort of cash crop commodities, flax, lentil, mustard, oats, rye, spelt, sunflower, wheat. So a wide variety collectively identified by a number of producers that they're actively producing. There's also other livestock and poultry activities that several of the key contacts we identified are involved in. So in this case, some hog production, some poultry, and some egg production on the side. And at least one individual was also involved with producing vegetables. The stakeholders that we interviewed represent at least 6 different provinces: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And at least 12 of the beef producers are involved in cow-calf operations, and only one producer is exclusively involved with feeder cattle. Approximately half of the beef producers have herd sizes in the 50 to 100 head range, while several have herd sizes in the 150 to 350 head range, and one producer had a significant herd size of over 1,000 cows. As part of our sort of additional sort of observations and data collection process, there was a organic livestock poultry supply chain panel that was hosted earlier this year, much earlier this year, in Eastern Ontario. And that included a number of relevant stakeholders, including an abattoir owner, an independent butcher, retailer, a beef producer, and several other sort of industry reps representing other sort of livestock sectors, including poultry, sheep, and hog producers. Another important element of the data collection or data that we looked at involved this national survey of organic sector stakeholders. This survey was conducted in March of 2021. And ultimately, there were about 370 stakeholders that participated in that survey. 35 stakeholders were involved in livestock production exclusively, and another 68 were involved in mixed operations where they were livestock and grain operations. There were also a number of processors that completed that survey, as well as distributors as well. So again, the information that we collected there wasn't specifically focusing on organic beef, but many of the findings served to reinforce and validate the themes that emerged from our key informant interviews. Similarly, with the Guelph Organic Conference and roundtable discussion that was held last year in January, there was a focus on looking at supply chain barriers, and several of the panelists shared their observations on the barriers that they've experienced directly or have knowledge of. And there were an additional 50 attendees in addition to the panel members who were polled on a series of questions to get at the supply chain barriers in the organic sector. So again, not that this conference necessarily focused on organic beef, but the findings that were coming out of that were relevant because, again, they helped us to reinforce and validate some of the major themes that were coming out of the key informant interviews that we conducted. And I'll quickly mention as well, finally, we did an extensive document review looking at the formal and gray literature, any data that was out there that was sort of relevant for the organic beef sector, and even the conventional sector, as that's important context for understanding some of the bigger shifts that are taking place and how that sort of feeds into what's happening in the organic sector. In particular this year with the issues around the drought, ongoing drought issues, ongoing COVID-19 issues, there was a fair bit of context that we were able to pull in from the literature, and also movements that are occurring in some provinces where there are greater allowances being allowed for some on-farm slaughter activities. And I'll revisit that in a bit as we sort of get into the challenges, certainly in the processing aspect of the supply chain. So I'm going to quickly sort of go through a bit of a snapshot of organic beef production and sales in Canada. And before I sort of focus on the organic piece, maybe a bigger picture on conventional / organic combined. What is happening with beef production in Canada? We know from census data that there's approximately 60,000 farms across Canada where more than half of the farm income is being derived from beef production. Now, average herd size isn't that large for all herds. It's around 69, but many farms are really smaller scale farms. In fact, 61% of the farms in Canada, this is all beef farms, not just organic, but all farms, account for about 16% of the total Canadian beef herd. And the herd size typically is under 50 cows. Now, what we've seen trend-wise over the last 15 years or so, since 2005, there's been about a 25% drop in herd size since the peak in 2005. This sort of coincided with sort of the BSE crisis coming out of 2003 that extended over a few years. after that. But as of 2019, the total sort of Canadian herd size, all beef animals, conventional and organic combined, was about 12.2 million. And that dropped by about 1 million to 11.2 in 2021. About 85% of the beef cow population is in Western Canada. And the total farm gate sales roughly with beef in Canada right now is at about $8.2 billion. So when we look at the organic side of this equation, though, it is difficult to come up with a comprehensive view of organic beef production. The data is a bit sketchy. It's available in different sort of, whether it's in different forms, whether it be the number of producers or the number of livestock. And we're sort of working with COTA right now, the Canadian Organic Trade Association, to come up with and try to determine a better estimate of what the numbers look like for the amount of production and the size of herds that are out there. We do know from 2017 that collectively there were about 740 organic livestock producers, and most of that was cattle or chicken related activity. But we also know that the organic beef accounts for a fairly small fraction of the total beef sales generated through retail chain grocery stores in Canada. And this clearly represents a significant opportunity for potential market growth. Now, the sales data that I've profiled here on the right-hand side of this slide, you have to keep in mind that this is for the major chain stores. This would include elements such as Sobeys and Loblaws and Metro, and as well as Walmart and London Drugs. It does not include Costco and Whole Foods. Some of the retailers are not able to provide or are not willing to provide data. And so we have to recognize that this is only a partial profile of sales activity. And it's the retail component, right? So this is not direct marketing off the farm. This is just what's going through these major retail stores. So it gives you a sense that, again, we're really sort of a tiny sort of amount or proportion of overall fresh beef. The organic component is quite small. As I've indicated there, 3.16 million sales of fresh organic beef products, or approximately less than 1% of total fresh beef sales in retail grocery stores. Just over 50,000 in sales of fresh organic, frozen organic meat patties, and just over 78,000 in sales of other frozen organic beef products through those main chains. I guess I quickly also mentioned we had a look at what was happening in the U.S. to give us a sense of, how do we compare relative to what's going on in the U.S. Scenario. So not unexpectedly, we have a relatively small organic livestock sector compared to the U.S. There was something like in 2019, about 533 farms had certified organic beef cows, and another 3,600 farms had other certified organic cattle, including organic bulls, beef calves, replacement elk heifers, and so on. And we know from the gross value of sales estimates in the US, with those numbers provided, that the value of the organic beef cows was approximately 9.1 million, and the value of other certified cattle sales was approximately $218 million. So again, as we sort of continue to have a look at the organic data that we're able to get through with COTA, we're going to come up with some kind of a projection and estimate of what that value is for the Canadian component. But it is still at this point something of a work in progress. So let's start to go through here and have a look at some of the barriers that we've identified through our consultation and the other data that we've had a look at. And at this point, I want to emphasize, we're not prioritizing these. This is something that we'll probably approach as we sort of look at getting into the final reporting details. But at this point, really just wanted to present, here are the barriers that we've encountered and wanted to share with the group this morning. So one of the consistent issues that came up in our discussions was this issue of there being a severe limitation on the availability and or high cost of quality certified organic feed. That includes both the fodder, the hay element, and the pasture land. Now, while beef producers are generally attempting to be mostly or entirely self-sufficient in terms of having sufficient fodder, it is not uncommon for them to encounter shortages at times. And in particular, the last few years and this year, with drought conditions, it has severely impacted hay production and pasture growth, resulting in shortages. Another issue that was raised as part of our discussions was the fact that wildfires can have a significant impact on the area of available pasture land, and it can take up to 2 years or more for that pasture land to grow back before that land can be grazed. Many of the producers confirmed that they have relied on external suppliers at times of feed shortage to at least meet a portion of their total feed requirements. But again, this can be quite challenging, given that there could be issues around the availability, which is quite limited. It could be also a matter that the feed is less than ideal quality, or in fact, it's the case that it is, because it's in short supply and it's organic, it is costly, and it's especially costly if that organic feed has to be transported any great distance. Several of the producers that we mentioned, that we interviewed, mentioned that, you know, the availability of organic feed and pasture land has been impacted by land that was traditionally used for hay production, increasingly being converted to higher paying cash crops. Right? So it is difficult for hay to compete with the returns being made on other commodities. Interesting, though, we know that we heard from, or when we were looking at the literature, there appears to be, you know, a large majority of the forages that could be considered in Western Canada might be considered as uncertified organic, given that there is no application of commercial fertilizer and no herbicide, no pesticides. So it seems that there is this pool of, or resource of potential fodder, pasture land, but it's just a matter that it is not sort of certified organic at this time. We also know that there are a couple of facilities that produce organic forage pellets, one being based in Saskatchewan and one in Ontario, in terms of supplying that type of material. Another issue that the producers raised with us was that it's difficult to know who exactly has organic hay for sale or pasture land for rent, right? So the information is not sort of readily accessible. It's hard to find, and it seems that this network is underdeveloped. And unfortunately, when sourcing organic feed is not feasible or practical, producers are typically responding by reducing the size of their herd and or sourcing non-organic feed and pasture land. So basically switching from an organic stream to a natural stream because of that, the organic shortage. Several of the producers reported that they're working with or examining regenerative farming practices and or other certification practices or standards, such as grass certification or humane certification. That may not strictly, you know, these are not strictly organic certifications, but they do align with many of their personal values and interests on sustainable farming and provide another form of credibility while providing greater flexibility when working within the organic certification parameters is not viable in their particular scenario. A couple of other issues that we heard around organic inputs. A couple of producers mentioned that it's difficult for them to access or source some of their organic feed supplements from local suppliers. Specifically, salt blocks was an issue in terms of trying to get something that was local and affordable. And we also heard that it was difficult for some producers to source the desired variety of certified organic seed. And there's also a cost issue with that as well. So many producers are relying on non-organic untreated seed, which is permitted when it can be demonstrated that the organic seed cannot be procured. And while this approach does enable organic producers to access their preferred varieties, it does raise issues with ultimately with the organic integrity for continuing to rely on uncertified, untreated seed. Now, in terms of a strategy, we're suggesting that ideally we should be looking at encouraging and supporting the implementation of grant programs and or tax incentives to encourage production and maintenance of organic fodder crops and pasture land. And also we would suggest that we need to encourage and support collaboration, encourage certifying bodies to offer a matching service to connect organic feed buyers and sellers. If this could be an additional service that certifying bodies would take on, I think it would help facilitate that connecting and interconnectedness to help those in need of an organic feed source link with those that have some availability or surplus. We also think that it's important to encourage and support collaboration between the organic industry, research institutions, and governments to develop and sustain a domestic organic seed research and breeding program. Just to ensure that, some form of domestic organic seed research and breeding program is in operation to ensure that varieties are optimal for local growing conditions and that they're resilient to disturbance such as climate change, and that this organic seed is accessible, affordable, et cetera, for producers. We think it's also important that we encourage and support farm supply stores and agents in identifying and sourcing organic inputs for their farming community region. The issue of land affordability and availability also came up. So producers mentioned that the cost of expanding their existing land base is prohibitive due to high land valuation. For example, we heard that the market price in Western Canada can be as high as 1.5 times the assessment value for cultivated and pasture land. And even marginal land is quite expensive, commanding a price as high as $5,000 an acre. In Eastern Canada, we heard that it's not unheard of to see good farmland selling for upwards of $20,000 an acre, and that land then is typically purchased by conventional grain producers and/or dairy poultry producers if it comes on the market. There's even issues with the availability and the affordability of rental land, which is further complicated by the lack of suitable infrastructure on that land, such as whether utilities or buildings or appropriate structures and fencing. We've heard that in some cases the land for rental land can be as high as $250 to $350 an acre, and that's just one region of Canada. As noted or described by one producer, land values are completely disconnected from food production value, and it's pretty much impossible for new farmers to afford land and hope to make money back on cattle. Now, this issue of land availability and affordability came up strongly also in the National Survey of Respondents. So it was flagged also by the Guelph Roundtable. In terms of a strategy, we're suggesting that we need to develop and support land matching programs to help organic producers find land to purchase or lease, and ensure that that service is offered in conjunction with other relevant sort of business support services. Now, when we look at this, we can sort of think of an umbrella of activities that we might sort of consider pursuing, such as farm linking, where we're pairing new organic farmers with retiring organic farmers to make sure that land transitions to the next generation, even where there's no sort of family bond that exists. And also considering looking at where retiring farmers can mentor young farmers to ensure that that business remains viable, and then transfer that ownership at some point through a financing arrangement. Also looking at cooperative farming ventures where potentially we're pooling a group of young farmers to come together where they gain enough capital to buy or lease the farm that they can share. Also maybe some consideration around farmland trusts. So this might be a community or conservancy group that comes together to raise the funds to purchase environmentally important and historic and imperiled farms, and then rent that land back to farms or young farms. And maybe perhaps to a long-term lease that will allow them to invest in equipment structures and so on. And finally, maybe looking at farm incubators. This is the case where maybe land is set aside by a local government or a municipality or an institution such as a university. And again, is used to help first-time farmers get started where they can rent the land for a defined period. And in this case, maybe just gain experience before they move on to a next stage of farming. Now, we did come across a number of farmers who at this point really are not that interested in expanding beyond their existing scale of production. They pretty much confirmed that their primary concern at this point is maintaining their existing scale, and their focus really is on fine-tuning efficiencies for the existing operation, maintaining a herd size that aligns with the carrying capacity of their land base at this time, and also their limitations of whatever they, what they have in terms of available labor. So they're already at a point where that is the scale that they're sort of pretty much committed to. Now, the producers that we spoke to are aware of the importance of succession planning, but typically it's not something that they're investing time in at this moment. Some producers are approaching retirement and some have young families. Those that are getting close to retirement aren't really sure what direction to take at this time, and that might involve maybe transitioning to other family members or a beginning farmer, or even maybe looking at share farming. Producers with young children or teenagers noted that at this point, the children it's too early for them to determine what their interests are with continuing in organic farming. But interestingly, we heard from producers saying that it might be the case that their kids have an interest in doing the crop aspect, but not so much the cattle, just given the range of uncertainties and challenges with raising livestock. So it's there's potential risk for some organic beef farms to go into crop production, to leave the livestock aspect behind because of the additional challenges that are and uncertainties associated with that production system. So we think it's important to continue to support farm succession planning to ensure that organic farms are sustained for the next generation producers. And we think it's also important to reach out to the newcomer population and Indigenous communities to explore potential investment opportunities with those groups to get behind the backing and the growth opportunities in organic farming, right? Now, we heard about this issue of, some producers are only interested really in the cow-calf aspect of beef production, and they do not want to be involved in the backgrounding and or the finishing part of it. But it appears that that part of the supply chain is underdeveloped. There's not a significant or substantial number of producers that sort of want to actively take on that part of the supply chain as a standalone piece where they're taking in calves off the cow-calf operations. Very limited number of operators are specializing in organic backgrounding or finishing. Producers looking to sell their calves into the organic stream have few choices, and it is not an ideal situation where there is only one local buyer. As a result, we've heard that some organic animals are going into conventional feedlots because they're not able to find that next stage of the supply chain that they would ideally like to sell into, but do not want to take on that aspect themselves. So this was identified by a few producers as being an entry point for someone who's looking for, I want to sort of fill a niche or fill an area where there is a need for a producer to come in and fulfill that role. So this is an entry point potentially for a new farmer to come in and sort of raises the importance of promoting and supporting opportunities for producers, new farmers, to fill this aspect in the organic beef production cycle. But it will be important to ensure that producers have access to relevant business development information or resources specific to these activities to help them reach their farm business goals. Another key part of this, of course, is access to capital, right? That there is startup capital and other sort of investment funding available to enable this to take place, which is the focus of this next slide. In general, this issue of it being difficult to access capital. It typically takes many years to build up a herd of cattle, and expanding the herd by purchasing organic cattle is challenging, especially when there is a limited availability and the animals command a premium price. As noted by one particular producer, the investment to maintain a few hundred head of cattle on a farm at one time is a tremendous amount of money. And it's challenging to secure sufficient investment capital to support scaling up organic beef production. So as a result, producers have to carry most of the cost themselves. And it's a considerable investment to manage the whole cycle from feeder calves to market animals. It was observed that ag-related banking incentives tend to focus on very large loans, $500,000 or more, and more lending options are needed for smaller investments to support small scale operations. Unfortunately, traditionally from the financial sector, farming is not viewed as the safest or the best bet in terms of where the financial institutions want to or hope to get their return compared to conventional farming. But we feel we really need to sort of turn this on its head and encourage financial institutions to recognize the societal and environmental value of organic farming and provide more favorable credit terms to producers who follow organic standards. Really, ideally, financial institutions should be providing more favorable credit terms to producers who follow organic standards. And in fact, the government should be getting behind providing incentives to banks based on societal and environmental benefits and savings realized through their portfolios. I think there's also a role here as well, though, for industry stakeholder groups to provide producers with tools to help them balance their financial production and environmental performance. I want to quickly touch on issues around labor. So the issue of being able to access a sufficient, a reliable, and affordable source of labor came up. And it's an issue for some producers, not all, but for some it is, right? And it's challenging for a variety of reasons, right? So there's just the general disinterest in farm work, disinterest in traveling or relocating to a farm that might be remotely located or just located in a rural area. And it's just having, how do you find those individuals who have a familiarity or a comfort level working with livestock? Working with livestock is not for everyone. In addition to that, you might be expected to work with equipment as well. So there is sort of a really specialized skill set and temperament that's needed to work with livestock. Some producers mentioned that they have been able to access reliable, affordable labor through the temporary foreign worker program. And that program is important to some producers. But as we've seen with COVID-19, access to that workforce was disrupted with the migrant worker restrictions that were put in place for a period during parts of COVID-19. In fact, COVID-19 has sort of magnified many of the vulnerabilities in the food supply chain, and especially with the reliance on temporary foreign workers and their importance in supporting food security in Canada. I'd also mention that there's an important role for municipalities and local planning offices to support the development of on-farm housing for workers. Again, this is another element that just helps to attract and ensure that, when you're trying to recruit that workforce, you've got those benefits are in place or those amenities are in place to make it easier for that individual to make that transition. This is especially crucial when there are no other accommodation options that are available in an area, and that on-farm housing is essential. So it's an issue really of, it's probably easier, we always think it's easier to sort of, once you've hired someone to keep that person on the farm than to have to continue to sort of have to go out there and recruit and rehire. So we really want to emphasize the importance of producers understanding their employee interests, their motivations, and their goals, and supporting their needs and interests, right? And this could be something well beyond something that it's monetary. So looking at compensation plans, looking at medical insurance, paid time off, having a company vehicle, access to housing, those types of benefits beyond the monetary, and also taking into consideration work-life balance. So making that job position as attractive as can be, and dedicating a bit more time to the management of human resources so that we're hopefully avoiding and cutting down on costly rehiring and retraining activities. We also want to emphasize that it's important to ensure that the temporary foreign worker program is maintained and that in fact it be made a bit more robust going forward so that it is sufficiently prepared for similar types of disturbances in the future as we've experienced with this COVID-19 phase. Right, I want to touch on limited abattoir capacity. I'm sure many of you were wondering when we were going to get to this. So this was a big issue that came up repeatedly in our discussions. It came up repeatedly in the literature and the documentation that we looked at. And it is not a new issue or challenge at all. This is a long-standing issue with the supply chain in Canada and as it relates to the meat sector. The conventional beef production has been encountering abattoir capacity issues for a long time, and options are especially limited for organic beef producers as certified organic abattoirs are relatively few in number and or distantly located, right? So as a result, we're seeing that organic cattle are being put through conventional abattoirs. And if there's only a small number of organic animals that are being processed, there really isn't much of an incentive for the plant owner to switch over and custom sanitize for that small run. So ultimately, the producer is not able to attach the organic label, and this results in a potential loss of premium price. Now, interestingly, we did hear from producers who said, who are involved in direct marketing and that their meat is going through a local abattoir that is not able to that is not certified organic. But they emphasized, that their customer base is sufficiently familiar with their organization and their on-farm organic practices. And for them, not having that certified label in there is not a deal breaker. It's not a great concern to them. In fact, the consumers seem to be quite strongly attached to the fact that that meat is locally produced as being sort of a key interest for them. I'd also mentioned that the shortage of abattoirs leaves producers vulnerable to plant closures and also to the demands and the conditions of a particular plant owner, if that's the only option that's local. Many of the producers mentioned that pre-booking space at the abattoir is essential. In some cases, producers are booking up to 8 months or 12 months or even more in advance. And because cooler space is limited, if a producer wants to hang their meat for a longer period, it really is essential that they get that order or that pre-booking in place to make sure that they've got that space reserved in the cooler to hang that meat. As a result of all these sort of related challenges, some producers have dropped or are considering dropping their certification because they're unable to find a local certified processor and or a way to efficiently market their product. But we feel that the opportunity for growth within the the processing industry is significantly restricted despite the high demand for services. And small local abattoirs and processing plants need financial assistance to comply with government regulations, maintain high worker and food safety standards and animal welfare to meet the local food demands. Now, the meat processing industry itself is also encountering difficulties finding qualified staff for their plants, even at their current capacity. And some older owners have indicated that they are more interested in retiring at this time than expanding their abattoir capacity. So this is going to continue to sort of maybe result in some decline in capacity unless these businesses can transition to new owners. In terms of strategies, we sort of suggest that and recommend that the provincial and federal government agencies need to continue to offer initiatives to support investment in meat plants and abattoirs to ensure that criteria terms are responsive to smaller scale operations in rural communities. In fact, funding should be specifically earmarked for smaller scale rural-based abattoirs, and the application process, the eligibility and the investment criteria, et cetera, needs to be adapted for these settings so that it's not simply the big players that are soaking up the funds that are dedicated to these funding pockets. We're also suggesting that provincial government agencies need to support alternative meat processing opportunities such as licensed mobile abattoirs and on-farm slaughtering and butchering. I'll share a couple of links with this group as we get to the end of this presentation. I'll put them up in the chat box. Alberta and BC have recently sort of modified their regulatory environment to allow for some of this activity. Some very interesting stuff happening there. And also I know that there's other provinces that are interested in adopting some of these types of policies. But in BC, for example, they have a couple of licensing options where an individual farmer can either in a farm gate license can slaughter on farm up to 5 animals a year. And then if it's a farm gate plus license, can slaughter up to 25 animals on their property in a year with certain protocols, requirements in place as part of that process. And again, I'll share the details on that at the end of this presentation, and we elaborate on that in more detail in our report. But it's encouraging to see some of the provincial governments getting behind this and opening up these opportunities for smaller scale processing activity on farm. We also think there's an important role for the regional or municipal governments to be more supportive of agriculture and food processing. So it is not uncommon for rural municipalities to have an economic development policy that in some cases provides matching funding for economic development projects. And we need to get behind these governments in considering the value added opportunities associated with agriculture and support the same kind of investment approach with value-added opportunities in agricultural processing, especially in light of the growing awareness and interest in the importance of local food and food security. So I want to touch a bit more on climate change and related challenges. I talked earlier about the significant impact that drought is having on producers this year. Wildfires and so on. So we are seeing an increasing frequency of extreme weather events associated with climate change, and it is impacting production activities and cycles, and producers are having to adapt more quickly to these changing conditions. We are seeing that farm practices associated with organic and regenerative farming support greater resilience in the context of climate variabilities, and research and practices will need to adapt going forward, right? So the development of drought tolerant crop varieties, looking at water management strategies, looking at soil conservation and nutrient recharge strategies, even sort of looking at, again, going back to the role of institutional support and knowledge transfer to make sure that we are staying on top of and getting it in front of as best we can the changes that are ahead of us. So in terms of a strategy here, really looking at supporting enhanced collaboration between all relevant stakeholders to advance organic farming systems. Producers really need to be informed about climate adaptation best practices, and it's important to build the knowledge base and confidence of producers to understand climate change events and appropriate practices. When I was sort of looking through the documentation literature and building that sort of the background profile for the report, I came across some commentary from industry stakeholders in Saskatchewan, and they are anticipating that because of the drought situation, they're anticipating that upwards of maybe 50% of the beef herds in Saskatchewan will be sold to slaughter due to the drought conditions. So this has severe sort of long-term consequences for the depletion of herds. As cows being taken out of the herd this year, there will not be calves in the spring as a result of that herd depletion. And then finally, I wanted to talk about what is potentially here, sort of, it's an ongoing risk and also an opportunity here for the industry. We've been hearing from different stakeholders about how the organic brand is sort of losing its meaning in the marketplace, right? The devaluation of the organic brand as a result of the proliferation of alternative branding that closely aligns with organic. So things like non-GMO, natural, sustainable, other sort of catchphrases that are being used but are not necessarily organic, but trying to sort of grab the consumer's attention. So all of this sort of eco-friendly branding could result in market erosion for organic products. And we need to sort of look at what we can do to sort of look at, what can we do to encourage more full and truthful branding on food products to enable consumers to make informed choices, right? The other thing is that climate change and COVID-19 have increased consumer interests in food security and local food options, right? And we've seen that in just increased home cooking, less eating out, and online purchasing increasing, right? And so producers have had to quickly adapt to the changing needs and interests of that market. Producers and retailers have also moved into an expanded online marketing activity, and consumer interest in online grocery purchasing has expanded at the same time. So there's an opportunity to further explore online marketing approaches to promote the benefits of organic and its ability to promote food security and local food options. So going forward, we feel that it's important to ensure that the marketing promotion of certified organic products enables consumers to easily differentiate the organic product from non-organic options. The resilience of organic farms and their ability to help mitigate climate change are important messages that need to be reinforced in marketing in the campaigns and to build on existing customer loyalty. Several producers also emphasize that there is an important role for retailers to take on in promoting organic products and informing consumers about the benefits of organic farming. So there is a role for there's a real role that the producers feel that retailers need to take on and do some of this lifting in addition to what producers are sort of working at. And producers also have recognized that we need to look at creative ways to help retailers break out of their customary selling and pricing approaches, right? So that they are enabling consumers to opt into organic options. And maybe this might mean something, for example, an example of producer provide where they're working with a retailer where they're allowing the customers to pay a premium price if they want to support organic producers and sustainable farm practices. So it gives them the option to begin to sort of have an affordable way in, and then if they want to commit and add a premium price on that, they can. And then of course there'll be, we're going to emphasize that there's an important role for relevant provincial and federal government agencies to monitor and regulate all of these sort of eco-friendly marketing claims to ensure that they are truthful and not misleading. So with that, we'll open this up for questions and discussion. And I'm also going to sort of just stop sharing here, and I'll post in the chat a couple of links to the on-farm licensed slaughtering documentation for Alberta and BC.
That's great. Thank you so much, Don, for your presentation. We really appreciate that. I have a couple of questions here, or one anyway. I was just looking at my clock, and we're 55 minutes before the top of the hour. So we have about 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. But one of the questions is, what sort of challenges has HCA encountered in trying to determine barriers to the beef supply chain? And do you have any suggestions on how we report and collect information going forward as a means to keep sort of on top of what's going on in the sector?
My first take on that is that it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. Producers are doing different things on their farm. So as I said, we can't say there's a typical organic beef farm. Some of them are involved in grain production. Some of them are involved in vegetable production. They have different herd sizes. They have different marketing approaches. So the real trick for us in sort of coming up with a strategy going forward is, how do we sort of customize or specialize this for an organic beef sector in general versus being more strategic around, if your operation is sort of specialized or customized in this area, what can I take out of that for my needs to help my operation grow or even to sustain its existing production? So The challenge has sort of been the variability in what a beef operation looks like, an organic beef operation looks like in Canada.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And since we're coming to a close, or we're ending our hour, I think we'll leave it with that one question for today. So just as we close, thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Harry, and others for attending today. We really appreciate you being here. And this webinar is an important milestone for the project, and Canadian organic growers would like to thank Harry Cummings and Associates, the Canadian Organic Trade Association, and Sask Organics, as well as the many producers and stakeholders for their important contributions. We'd also like to acknowledge our appreciation for financial support provided by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Join us for similar webinars covering organic blueberries, salad greens, oats, and field peas in the new year.